Welcome to the Stevens-Coolidge Place in North Andover. I'm Kathy Macdonald, the director, and I'm pleased to introduce you to Joann Vieira, who is the Director of Horticulture for the Trustees, who will be taking you on your garden tour today.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Stevens-Coolidge Place. My name is Joann Vieira, and as Kathy told you, I'm the Director of Horticulture for the Trustees statewide in Massachusetts, and it's such a pleasure to be here on this property and to walk around the gardens here with you. This property actually was the summer home of Helen Stevens-Coolidge and her husband, John Gardner Coolidge, and they came to this property in 1914 when Helen inherited the property from her sister. And almost immediately they got busy on this lovely place, establishing their gardens and renovating the home. They hired an architect, Joseph Chandler, who was really well known for his work as a preservation architect, and had him do some renovations to the house, making it suitable for them for their summer home. And then they used him to help them get busy on the gardens here. And we are standing here at the top of the stairs that lead down to the rose garden. We'll just head down in this direction, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this garden. As we walk through the gardens, I'll talk a little bit about the history of each, and we'll talk too about some of the plants that you're going to see in each of the gardens. So this garden was Helen's fragrant garden. It had previously been the site of the barn. And Helen wanted to establish a garden of fragrance here to help sort of mask the odors of the farm. And so the barn was picked up and moved a little bit further afield so that those odors and sounds were moved a little bit away from the core of the property. And they hired masons to come in and build these beautiful stone walls that you see around us and establish the garden beds that you see around this wonderful rectangle of lawn. They also put in the beautiful reflecting pool at the center of the garden here and began to cultivate roses that had great fragrance. That work happened in 1926, and in 1927 they came back in and put in the greenhouse that's adjacent to this garden, which allowed them to have plants throughout the winter season and a beautiful garden space that would be warm and pleasant during the winter months. So even though they used it primarily as a summer garden, they still cultivated plants year-round and used those plants out in the gardens, in the containers that you see around this garden and elsewhere on the property. In the 1900s, actually the property came into our hands in the early 1960s. Helen left it to the trustees, wanting it to be preserved, wanting it to be available for all people to enjoy. They loved to entertain here, and they really wanted to make sure that that welcome and that sense of engagement of the community continued. So the trustees cared for this property lovingly from the 1960s up until today, of course. But in the 1990s, this garden underwent a significant renovation. The roses had declined during that time period, and the staff at the time spent many, many hours finding the right roses, historic roses for this garden, finding the right fruit trees to espalier or train on the walls, as you see here, and really rejuvenated the garden. Now, some 30 years later, the garden is ripe and ready for another rejuvenation. And so our plan for the next few years is to point up the walls again and to continue to add in historic roses back into this garden. In the meantime, we're incorporating a lot of fragrant annuals in the garden so that we're doing exactly as Helen had wished, creating great fragrance here in the garden and creating a space of great welcome throughout the whole growing season. So as we walk through, I'll just point out a couple of the fragrant plants that we've incorporated this season to make this a really lush and lovely space. So if we go a step over to the beds here, you can see a couple of fragrant plants right in front of us here. This beautiful purple flower is heliotrope. And it's a plant that's been cultivated for many, many generations. This particular cultivar is a more modern cultivar, but it's something that Helen might have used in her own garden to bring in that wonderful scent. Some people think it smells like baby powder. Really a beautiful color and fragrance. And right behind it, this lovely white flower is a flowering tobacco, Nicotiana. And this particular cultivar is called Fragrant Cloud. So it really emits, especially late afternoon, this wonderful sweet scent. There's also behind it, and not in bloom yet, this grassy foliage, which is a peacock gladiola, a really wonderful annual plant. It's a little bulb or corm that's planted each year and creates a beautiful fragrance as well in this garden in the late summer. You can see we've also added in things like cosmos just to give us a nice bloom, and some verbena down along the edge. One of the unique features in this garden is this interesting little hedge of euonymus, a plant that's not often used this way to edge. It's more likely used as a climbing vine. And on the opposite side of the garden around the fountain, you can see another species of this euonymus grown up and over and around that, which is the more common way to cultivate it. So really an interesting, very historic and unique feature in this garden. As we leave the rose garden, we're going to step into the perennial garden. The perennial garden actually predated Helen and John's time on this property. Helen's sister had the property before she did. Helen inherited the property in 1914 from her sister Gertrude. Gertrude actually established this perennial garden prior to Helen and John coming to the property. You can see that this garden has this main grass path right down the center, and that grass path is aligned on the beautiful bow window at the back of the home. So the garden was really designed to be part of that whole, inside out type of garden where people are designing their views that they'll see from indoors. It is primarily a summer garden, since this really was a summer home for Helen and John, but there are interesting things in this garden throughout the entire growing season. So early in the spring, thousands of tulips come up in this garden, make a show with the early blooming perennials. In early June, the peonies are in bloom, and they're fabulous in this garden, along with bearded iris. It's a spectacular display. And then during this time of the year, in the height of summer, you'll see a lot of daylilies, you'll see summer phlox, golden glow, which is a rudbeckia that people often grow, particularly in historic gardens of this nature. So this garden was renovated in 2015. A volunteer who was a student of landscape architecture found in our archives the historic plans for this garden and was able to find the original slips for the plants that were purchased for the garden. So she was able to really trace back the dimensions of each garden bed and find a lot of the plants that were originally in this garden. And so what you see is actually a very accurate restoration of the historic garden that was here when the Stevens-Coolidges came to this property. There were some cultivars of plants that were no longer available that have been supplanted by superior cultivars, and so she did her very best to duplicate the feel in those plants as well if she wasn't able to find the original cultivar. So this really is a historic restoration, but also you can see that many of the plants that are in this garden are plants that we still grow today because they were terrific selections made for both historic and modern gardens. So let's take a walk right down the main path here, and we can stop and take a peek at some of the plants that we see along the way. Right in this very spot, you can kind of see that layering of plants. This yellow foxglove is finishing its bloom. So 2 weeks ago, this was lined with those beautiful yellow foxgloves on it. The lovely yellow daylily is now at its peak, and every day each of those flowers fade, and our volunteer team comes in and actually removes the spent blossoms to keep this looking great and to have it continue focusing its energy on flowering rather than seed production. And yet to come is still a wonderful anemone here. So in another few weeks, this is going to be in full bloom, and another whole life in this garden will be revealed. It has a really wonderful fall interest as well. I tell you, I mentioned volunteers, and we would not be able to maintain these gardens. They would not look as great as they do without this wonderful core of volunteers who come in once a week, spread themselves out across the property, and just take care of every little detail. Today they were in cutting back the foliage on some of the iris that you can see here. So the bearded iris foliage gets a little tattered this time of year, so they've come in and just cleaned that up a little bit. And so they're constantly fussing and helping us to care for this wonderful place. So let's continue right out through the fence here, through the hedges, and we'll go along into the next garden space. You know, part of the great joy of this property is that it's not just one garden, one space. It's a series of garden rooms that you wander through. You experience each of them very differently, but you're surrounded by this beauty. So we have 91 acres here, and the garden portion is very small. There's quite expansive acreage that once was used to cultivate crops, and there were some cattle here at one point. And so now that surrounding beauty just gives this wonderful sense of peace and restfulness to this property. We're in the midst of doing some renovations here and transforming this property, adding to the current gardens. And so when you come to visit the garden, you'll see the signage that we have that shares with you some of the details of what we're doing. We had on the lawn behind me, there was a giant 250-year-old ash tree that was here that had started to crack and open up. The interior portion was hollow, and we had to have that removed. And so we're honoring that ash tree with some information here about its life and its history. It was well known in the community. People came and had their pictures taken around the tree. Kids climbed the tree, school groups gathered in the shade of the tree. And so we know that it's missed in the community. And so we're honoring it here. But also our forward-thinking staff had previously planted another tree beyond it to take its place. So as we continue to develop the gardens, that tree will take center place along the Great Lawn, and we will incorporate a garden in front of it that brings attention more to that feature. I just want to share with you too a quick look at some of the future expansion and before we head off to the French garden. So on this sign, when you're here visiting, you can take a closer look and you can see we've just come through the rose garden and the perennial garden. We're going to head over to the French garden here, but you can see in many of the other areas that were previously uncultivated in this garden, we're adding some new garden spaces and actually adding some additional parking and a new entryway to this property. So lots of excitement yet to come. This is a great way for you to learn more about that. And when you're here visiting, you can see how we are progressing with that project and continue to come back and see us as we continue to really fulfill this dream for this property. So let's take a walk over to the French garden. So the French garden is one of my favorite gardens on this property. It is a garden that is both productive in terms of edible crops, so lots of vegetables incorporated in this garden, but it's also highly ornamental in the French garden or the French potager tradition, where they really combined beauty and production all in one. One of the interesting features of this garden is this beautiful wall. We'll step in a little bit closer and I can show you a little bit better. This beautiful brick wall along the edge of the garden. So that wall is a serpentine wall. It's actually 1 brick thick. So very interesting that serpentine form allows for a strength that lets you build a wall that's only 1 brick thick. If that was a straight wall, it'd have to be many bricks thick in order to be able to stand straight. So interestingly enough, the wall was actually built to harken back to the Coolidge history. John Gardner Coolidge was the great-great-grandson of Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson had a wall built like this down at the University of Virginia. And so they wanted to duplicate that here, not only because it's a lovely wall, but because it also speaks to the family history. It also actually provides this wonderful, warm growing space. So facing south, it reflects southwest, it reflects the heat back into the garden and allows anything that's grown in the zone at the base of that wall to emerge a little bit earlier than other things in the garden. So let's have a walk through this very formal layout. This garden was actually restored in 2000, again by a volunteer who was very interested in the history and interested in landscape architecture, and she restored it back to its original proportions. After the trustees had taken the property over, the garden was transformed into a lawn with some ginkgos in it for the ease of maintenance, really. But when this volunteer could see that we were ready to move a little bit forward with this project, she helped to redesign the garden. And so it has been maintained by volunteers and staff in this beautiful arrangement now since early 2000s. So let's take a peek at some of the plants in here. You can see that we're incorporating some beautiful amaranth here that's really grown. Amaranth is edible, of course, but it's really grown because it's so beautiful. But we do a little bit of harvesting in this garden as well. There are, of course, a great selection of herbs in this garden. One of the mints here, which when you're here, you're welcome to take a little pinch and see what that smells like. It's just fabulous. Mints are pretty aggressive plants. They take a lot of room, and so it's a constant battle keeping this in this nice, neat row. But it's really worth it, you know, really terrific plant. And lots of the herbs are used in our educational programs that we do here at the garden. We have a really nice selection of both garden design and herb and craft programs that go on throughout the year at Stevens-Coolidge Place. Take a look at the thyme now. You know, lots of the plants that are in this garden, those ornamental things that you see, aren't just here for the purpose of their aesthetics, but they actually serve to draw pollinators in to help pollinate the vegetables that are in this garden. And if you take a quick look at this thyme, you can see several types of bees, honeybees, bumblebees, other bees, all throughout this massive thyme here. Really quite interesting. So even great plants like oregano here, some lavender, really some great scents. We have a good population of rabbits, and so the rabbits are chewing on lots of the plants in this garden, hence the fencing that's around the garden. But they leave a lot of these fragrant and aromatic herbs alone, so they really work well for us in keeping a presence in the garden throughout the growing season. So you can see this combination of ornamental plants as well as edible plants. We've incorporated crab apples to give us some height and structure in this garden. There are fruit trees, both espaliered or trained on the brick wall, but also in the garden itself. So we've crossed the main lane that sort of bisects the property. And here we're in a space that's a little more quiet on one end, but will be developed into a garden in the future where we can engage families and have a little bit of fun. We're playing around here with, you can see this little structure, this hoop. We're playing around with a mock-up of what will become a tunnel with plants trained over it, which we think will be a really fun and interesting feature for folks. And you can see just beyond that, there are some more edible plants here. This used to be the site of the vegetable garden. And so the grapes that are here, the raspberries, are all part of the remnants of that garden. But this beautiful 150-year-old oak tree began to really shade this part of the property. And so it wasn't possible to really grow a productive garden here any longer. So we've transformed this into both lawn and, you'll see on the other side of the grapes, a cut flower garden. Oh, here's a few grapes. A little early for these. The raspberries and blackberries are starting to ripen, but the grapes have a little ways to go yet. So this lovely garden had been a pick-your-own garden. And in the past year, we have, as we've dealt with with changing circumstances in our society, we have transformed this garden to a CSA cut flower garden. So our team actually helps to harvest from this garden and create the bouquets that go out to those who've purchased the CSA, and it was incredibly popular. The other thing that we're doing in this garden, and it's hard to see from here, but the last two rows have a lot of vegetables in them. So both from the French garden and from this garden, there's a lot of produce that's generated that's donated to a local food bank. So we feel really good about that way that we can give back. And as you walk through this garden, you'll see lots of color. The plants that are in here were chosen specifically because they make great cut flowers. So cosmos, for example, that have a long stem and provides really a great flower for an arrangement. And there's a double flowered form. There's a lovely pale yellow form here. You'll see a fully double form a little bit further on, and really trying to mix up the colors so that there's something for everyone in this garden. This portion of the operation will actually move in that transformation. So this will be, again, changed into a garden that has more interest for families and is a really relaxing space. And the cut flower operation will actually move to another portion of the property. So we're back full circle, back to where we started our tour. I just wanted to point out this beautiful greenhouse, which was part of the whole tradition of the summer home. It is now filled with interesting potted plants that come out to the garden for the summer months, and it's really quite a beautiful backdrop for the gardens. I'm so glad that you joined us today. We hope that you'll come and visit in person and meander through the gardens, take your time, ask the staff and volunteers questions, and really enjoy this place. And keep an eye on us as we continue to grow.